Hi, my name is Richard Curtis. I'm an imaging consultant here at Adobe. And today we'd like to focus on workflow. And what I want to do is talk to you about smart objects and the new Camera Raw filter inside Photoshop. So let me just recap what a smart object is. A smart object is essentially a container. And it can contain anything inside Photoshop, from layers to groups to smart objects to many other things. It's a really great way of increasing performance in Photoshop, but also enabling you to work on multiple layers at any one point in time, but also enables really nice non-destructive workflow on your layers. And we'll look at that a little bit later on in this demo. Camera Raw filter is a great way of applying non-destructive edits using the Camera Raw technology that can be found in Lightroom and can also be found in Photoshop. Now traditionally, the Camera Raw filter is only available when you open up a RAW file from Bridge and then bring it to Photoshop. But now you can use that Camera Raw filter on any layers or smart objects that we just talked about to make your edits using the Camera Raw technology. This is really handy because it means that we can use all of that technology to really enhance your pictures, but use it on anything inside Photoshop, be it a smart object or just a normal layer. So let's look at this now. So these pictures were shot in Bhutan at this religious festival. And I'm going to make some very simple adjustments inside Lightroom. So I'm going to move it into the development mode. And we're just going to look at the histogram, and we can see that I might need to do something around my highlights. So just bring those back and open the shadows up a little bit. And I want to set the white point and the black point. I'm just going to use the Alt key to see where I'm clipping. Okay? So now I'm going to open this inside Photoshop, but I'm going to open it as a smart object. And what this means is that the image won't be converted into a rasterized image. It will be taken across into Photoshop as a RAW file, and any Lightroom adjustments will be carried with it. And inside the Photoshop file will be a single layer, and in that layer will be the RAW file and the adjustments in Lightroom, which means at any point in time I can go back and re-edit the adjustments that I've made in Lightroom, but using Camera Raw. So to do that, I'm going to right click on this image, edit in Photoshop as a smart object. Okay, so here's the image inside Photoshop, and you can see here that I've got my smart object layer. If I double click on this smart object layer, it will open the contents inside Camera Raw, that being the RAW file and any adjustments that I made in Lightroom. And you can see that here with my highlights and shadows, whites and blacks, and I can change that at any point in time in my workflow. So the idea is I'm keeping my edits non-destructive for much longer. I'm not having to commit really early in my workflow to a rasterized file. I'll just cancel that for now. Now what I'd like to do if I look at this picture is just work on this picture and make it much better. There's 2 or 3 elements that I want to fix. One is this person in the background is really not helping the picture at all, and also this chair as well is also not helping the picture. So these 2 items need to disappear. Also, I captured this shot at quite a high shutter speed, which means that I froze the action. And actually, by looking at this picture now, I think I could do with a little bit of motion on this dancer. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of these 2 objects in the scene. Now, the traditional workflow is to duplicate the layer and then remove it from a non-background layer, so we're not working on those pixels. But actually, that will increase the file size because every time we duplicate a layer, we're doubling the amount of pixels on the screen and in the file. So what I can do is use a new layer and use that new layer to carry any pixels that I modify. So if I choose the patch tool, make sure it's in content aware mode. Now the adaptation level has slightly changed in this version of Photoshop. And I now have a color value, and the color value enables me to blend the color from the source to the destination, as well as the normal textures and the lighting that we do as part of the content aware technology. So let's just get rid of this stool very quickly. I'm just going to draw an area around this stool. Now to do this and use the empty layer, you do need to have this little feature turned on here, which is enable to patch all layers, because this will look at all the layers and not just the layer you're currently parked on. So to fix this, I've selected the area that I want to patch. I'm going to drag this area around and choose a source area. Now notice I'm lining up the floor and the crowd from the source to destination. This will make the patch blend much better. You can see that when I do that though, if I zoom in, you can see there's a bright spot in this area now. And this is down to the colour blending. If I go to the colour in the adaptation, while the selection is still made, I can modify the colour blend. And you'll see there that Photoshop does a really great job of blending the colour values in with the texture and the lighting. So now I just want to go to this other object, and I'm just going to select this again using my pen. I'm going to blend this with another part of the scene in exactly the same way as I did just now. And you can see that Photoshop's done a great job. And the colour value used was the same as the previous colour value I used, which was 3. So you can see it's blended that in quite nicely, and I have this nice transition there now, so you can't really see that I've made that adjustment. So now I want to add motion to this dancer. You can see, as I've just done, I've replaced those figures in the background with the patched area. And I want to keep that intact, so that when I save this PSD file, all my changes will be there, ready for the next time I open the file. This gives me that non-destructive workflow. For the best thing to do is to use Smart Objects to wrap these 2 layers up and keep them contained in this container. So I select them using the Shift key, go to my flyout menu and choose Convert to Smart Object. This will essentially wrap these 2 layers up inside that container and leave me with a single object to work on. At any point in time, I can double click on this layer and it will take me back into the previous edits, even if I save the file. Now I want to add some motion. So we've got this great new feature inside the 2014 release of Creative Cloud of Photoshop. And that new feature is the path blur, which will enable me to put blur on a motion path. And that's available through the filter, blur gallery, path blur. Now, I'm using this on a smart filter, which means that it will apply the filter and apply the effect, but I'm able to go in and double click on the effect and modify it later, so it keeps it again non-destructive. You can see here that I have an initial path, and the initial path is affecting the whole scene. So I'm just going to re-navigate this path to down where the dancer starts to move and where the path needs to finish around his head. And you can see there that it's done that. Now I can control the speed of the motion by modifying the speed in the little slider here, and I can just tailor that down so it's not as aggressive. But notice I have a little dot on this path. Now I can use the path like a Bezier curve. I can just drag this around and the motion will run across this path in this direction. So you can see that I really add that swooping motion into this figure. Now that blur has affected the dancer, but has also affected the background. So what I want to do is isolate the image, and to do that I'm just going to create another motion path. And you can see here that the motion path will continue if I wanted to do, but I don't. So I'm just going to go to the end of the path and click it to finish that motion blur. Again, I can move this around as I need to do, and I can bend it if I want to do as well. But I want to contain this part of the image and not have any motion. So to do that, I need to go to each end, and I need to change the endpoint speed. I can turn the endpoint blur shapes on, which will show me those in red, and I can move them around if I need to as well to change how that motion will run. But obviously I need to slow it down, and slowing it down will remove the motion on that path at that point. So I just set that to 0 and do the same thing on the other end of the path. And you can see now that actually there's no motion being applied to this part of the scene, only to this part of the scene over here. But it does include some people over here, and we're going to fix that in a second. If I press OK, it will then commit that change. And if we now look at the layers inside Photoshop, you can see we have the blur filter applied here, and we also get a free mask. At any point in time, I can go and modify the blur by double clicking on it, and it will take me into the blur itself, which I can then modify, which is really handy, and again, it keeps it non-destructive. The mask on this blur and on this smart filter is particularly useful. What it means is that I can actually control what's being blurred out and what's not being blurred by painting with black and with white. Remember, black will conceal part of the effect and white will reveal. This is all white at the moment, so all that effect is coming through and being represented on the image. If I select my brush with the B key and make sure my foreground and background colours are reset with the D key, and then use the X key to switch the foreground and background, that will put black in the foreground. I can now select a nice soft brush and I can paint. And as I paint, I will start to remove the blur from the background. And you can see that happening now. Just in case anything was not caught by the stop motion line and just around the area where the figure is blurred. At any point in time I can go and look at the mask by pressing the Alt key, clicking on the mask, and I can then continue and just make sure I've caught everything. So this is showing me the mask, and again you can see I'm painting here with black and you can see exactly what I'm painting. To get back to the picture with the mask in place, you can press the Alt key and click back on the mask again. At any point in time if you want to remove the blur and show what it looks like before and after, you can just click on this little eye icon next to the mask and it will then reapply the blur so you can see that happening in real time, which is great. Now this smart filter object here allows me to have multiple filters applied. However, if I do that when using the mask will interact with the other filters as well. So for example, I want to use the camera raw filter to enhance this picture even more by opening the shadows up and work on the white point, the black point, maybe using the radial filter to darken down the figure, and all the things I have available to me in the camera raw filter. What I don't want to do is have the mask that I've now worked on to interact with that filter. So what I need to do is not apply the filter here, which I could do with the camera raw filter, but is to actually wrap this modification into a smart filter as well. Once I've done that, it will then contain just those changes in that level of the smart filter and then give me a layer back. So I've got the smart object enabled, so I've just converted that I've just converted the changes into a smart object, so it wraps that all up. Go into the filter menu, camera raw filter, and this will apply that non-destructive camera raw filter onto that smart object. At which point now I can then work on my adjustments for this image, so I can change the exposure, I can change all my contrast, highlights, my shadows, pretty much anything in camera raw I can change. I can even go and change the split toning, I can go and change any effects, grain and post-crop vignetting, all that kind of stuff I can change on this filter. But all I'm going to do actually is just to refocus the viewer on the dancer. And at the moment there's equal exposure between the dancer and the background crowd. And ideally what I want to have is the crowd darkened down a little bit and more emphasis on the dancer. And I can do that very quickly by using the radial filter. The radial filter can be applied by just dragging on the area that I want the effect to work on. So by default, when you pull the radial filter out, outside of the radial filter will be affected by the changes that I'm making inside camera raw. So I'm going to turn the mask off for a second so you can see what's happening. If I dial the exposure down, you can see outside of the area of the dancer is now darkened down, and that darkening will give the viewer a focus on the dancer. Just a little bit of exposure there, just to dial it down. But notice that parts of the costume fall outside the radial filter, which means they'll be darkened as well, which I don't really want. So I'm just going to zoom out so I can see all of the ellipse, and I'm just going to rotate that into position and move it so that the dancer is all covered. Just like so. But part of the dancer's costume is also now not included in this radial filter. So what I can do is turn on the mask and I can turn on the brush. Once I turn the brush on, I can now paint away additional areas of the mask, so the effect will show through on parts of the costume that are currently being blocked or currently being hidden by the mask. So I'm going to choose the minus keep the exposure where it is, and all I'm going to do is paint. And as I paint, you can see the mask is being removed around those areas. I'm just going to make sure that everything is covered. And you can see there, I'm painting in the effect and enhancing the radial filter. If I turn on the mask, if I turn off the mask, you can see now that the costume is now part of the mask as well. So you can see here, by modifying the radial filter and using the brush to actually paint out additional areas that are not covered by the radial filter, means that I can now darken down the crowd in this example so that the dancer and his costume has maximum impact for the viewer. Also, by darkening down the background means that the viewer will stay focused on the dancer, because the black will repel the eyes. So as my eye comes into the scene, it sees the dancer and it sees the black areas, or the darkened areas. And the darkened areas will keep my eyes focused on the dancer, because he's nice and bright. So the bright will attract the eyes and the dark will repel the eyes. So it means I can focus the viewer into where I want it to be. The viewer won't see the darkened area as much, because it will just be a natural blend, but it means that I'm controlling the viewer, because I want the viewer to stay in my picture as long as possible. Once I finish my edit, I can then press OK. Photoshop will add the effect to that camera raw filter, and at any point in time, if I need to go and modify the filter, I can double click on it and it will take me back into the adjustment, which I can then modify as required. I can now save that file as a PSD with all of my adjustments ready for next time I go into this file. And just to recap there, if I want to go back and look at the motion blur, at any point in time, I can just double click on the layer. It will open up the motion blur, which I can then modify. If I want to go back and look at the patch, I can go back, it shows me the patch. And if I go back again, I can go into the original raw file with the original Lightroom adjustments. If I now save the file as a PSD using Command S on a Mac or Control S on a PC, that will save it to the same location as the original raw file and will be available then in Lightroom. You can see now in Lightroom I have my image, which is a PSD, and you can see the blur effect on the dancer, and the effect has been applied. If I want to re-edit this in the future, I can use my standard Command E or Control E on a PC to open this file in Photoshop. Lightroom will ask me if I want to open the original PSD file or a copy of the file or one with the Lightroom adjustments. Now, once I'm in Photoshop and made the adjustments in Photoshop, I won't reapply any adjustments inside Lightroom. And that's because I can use the camera raw filter inside Photoshop. So I don't need to make any changes and complicate that workflow. I can just do everything now inside Photoshop. When I edit the original document, it will then open up the original file inside Photoshop that I've been working on just now. And now I can go in again, and I can go in and re-edit my adjustments as I need to do. So you can see here that I'm keeping my edits non-destructive. It means that I can go into the future and re-edit my pictures and re-edit my adjustments without fear of losing any data or fear of damaging any pixels. So this is a really great workflow, and you can use Photoshop as a companion application to Lightroom to really use the power of that to get all those dramatic effects and all those special effects that we can do inside Photoshop on your image. So just to recap what we've seen there, we've seen how to take an image into Photoshop from Lightroom as a smart object to keep that workflow non-destructive for much longer. Be able to go into Photoshop, make my adjustments, my edits and my patches, be able to wrap up layers as smart objects, and then to be able to apply adjustments to those smart objects and keep them non-destructive and re-editable for much longer. So I hope you enjoyed that and found that useful. Thanks very much. See you soon. Bye bye now.